Hi, everybody. Hope you're doing well. The focus of this lecture is on explaining growing support for Trump among Latino Hispanic voters, trying to understand why that is. Along the way, I do several other things as well. One is that I bring in the concept of culture wars, and I look at how anti-LGBT discourse connects Latinos and people in other racial groups to Trump and the Republican Party. So we look at culture wars, and I haven't done that previously. Uh, I also highlight the high degree of linked or shared fate among African American voters. Uh, that's something that I'll explain when we get there. And I also take the opportunity to discuss a little bit Harris's opportunity economy platform. We've already looked at what I believe is the center of Trump's economic platform, which is the tariffs. So I think I give a little context and I talk a little bit about the opportunity economy platform of Harris. The order of how this goes is that I'm going to begin with background statistics, emphasizing the diversity of Latinos and establishing that the Latinos are moving towards Trump. And in emphasizing the diversity of Latinos, it's one of the important messages is to realize that Latinos are not monolithic and that their experiences vary quite a bit. And that thus affects their political positions as well. Then I move into three big explanations for why Latinos are turning towards Trump. The first one is more sort of about the racial order and Latinos' position within the racial order. And it focuses on the role of Latinos' sense of shared fate, and the importance of the strength of Latino identity for understanding their political positions. And I work on explaining why that matters. I talk about the different strategies that Latinos have for fitting into the racial order, the U.S. racial order, which I think also influences their political positions. And then I also look at the influence of xenophobia on Latinos as well, and the sort of unique ways in which they need to process xenophobia and how that's connected to the American identity in some ways. I also then, the next big explanation is I link the Latino voting patterns, and I also look at other racial groups at the same time, but I link Latino voting patterns to racial threat, which we've talked about before, and I focus there primarily on immigrant threat. And then I also look at linking Latino voting patterns to the culture war strategy of the Republican Party. Finally, I look at the influence of how Biden and Harris are held responsible for the high COVID inflation that we had in the COVID era, and the economic stresses that this causes. And it's in that context that I talk about Harris's opportunity economy platform. So I hope you enjoy the lecture. I hope you have lots of interesting reactions, and let's get going. The first thing we should do is look at changes in presidential support among Hispanic voters. This breaks it down by the Democrats and the Republicans. Of course, the Republicans, in all instances that this was the presidential candidate was Trump. In 2016, it was Hillary Clinton for the Democrats. In 2020, it was Biden. And in 2024, it's Harris. So what we see here is a pretty clear trend of Hispanics moving from the Democrats to the Republicans. The easiest way to see that is to look at that far right column that says the margin, the gap of Democrats minus Republicans was 39% in 2016. It was 26% in 2020, and it looks like it's shrinking more to 19% in this very recent Times Siena poll. I say it looks like it because polling can be inaccurate, and we don't know. We won't know until we get till the election's over. So an important question becomes, why is Trump doing better with Latinos in 2024 than previous years? I want to repeat my caveat that we don't know about 2024 yet. This isn't for sure. The polls might be wrong, and support for Trump is soft in some polls among Latinos. And what I mean by soft is they ask not just who you're going to vote for, but how certain you are about your vote. And among Trump supporters, Latino Trump supporters, that support shows up as being less certain than the Harris supporters. That's not all polls, but some polls. I would like to frame it this way. This is a campaign where Trump is blatantly stereotyping undocumented immigrants. And as I've talked about before, when Americans think about undocumented immigrants, they think Latinos. So there's this strong association between Latinos and undocumented immigrants, which doesn't mean that all undocumented immigrants are Latinos, but that there is that strong cognitive connection that most Americans make. So Trump's blatantly stereotyping the undocumented, and he plans to deport all undocumented immigrants. And the question, I think, then becomes, how could so many Latinos who are the target of scapegoating by Trump vote for Trump? That's the kind of query I have. You may have other, I'm not saying that's the only way to frame it, but that's what's most interesting to me. Now, the typical answer of this, and you can find literally hundreds, maybe thousands of articles that say something like, wait, Latino voters are not monolithic, they're diverse, and there's many subgroups, and some of these subgroups support Trump more for logical reasons. I agree with this, but I also think that it stays at the surface and it doesn't help us understand things as well. Although I'm not arguing against this, but I wanna go a little further, go a little deeper. Some of the subgroups that Trump does better with are American-born Latinos, non-Spanish speaking Latinos. The largest group of Latinos, if you look at if you sort of break Latinos down, one way of saying it is that that the third generation Latinos are among the largest growing group now. And what are they? They're American born, and many of them do not speak Spanish. Cuban nationality and the Dominican Republic nationality. So Cuban and Dominican Americans lean towards Trump pretty strongly. Latinos who are Protestant Christians, a much larger group than some people are aware of. Often they are evangelicals. They're quite strongly for Trump. Small business owners lean towards Trump. People who are higher income Latinos, those whose family incomes or household incomes are over $100,000 a year. So kind of the upper middle classes and higher. Economically, they also lean towards Trump and the Republican Party. Another group that got focused on a lot in the 2020 election, that if you followed that at all, you may have heard about, was the Tejanos living in the Rio Grande Valley, bordering Mexico. And if you're interested in that group, I think there's a lot of really good uh, uh, journalistic accounts of that group. If you go back to the 2020 election, many of them identified as Hispanic and as white on surveys, and we'll talk more about that pattern in a little while. Before going into more depth in explaining, I think it would be a good idea for us to just look at some patterns. The first pattern I want to look at here is to just, what is the breakdown? And as we can see that in this was polls taken between August 26th and September 2nd of this year. Harris was leading Trump among Latinos 57% to 39. That's a substantial gap. But as we pointed out, it's not as strong of a gap as in the past, and that's part of what we're trying to explain. If we look over on the right, we see in this poll, the gap, there's a little bit of a gender difference, but not much. There's a little more of an age difference with younger voters supporting Harris more than older voters. Here the cutoff is 18 to 49 and 50 and over. There's an education gap, which shows up in all the polls I've seen. It's not a huge one, but look at those with high school or less, 53% for Harris, and bachelor's degree or more, 61% for Harris. The difference for Trump is not as much because the differences come more in terms of choosing neither of those or other, right? But there is this education gap. I do want to point out that this is one of the problems of looking at social class only through education. You may recall that I just got done saying that it's actually that wealthier voters, higher income voters, lean towards Trump. And whereas here you're seeing higher education voters lean towards Harris. Both of those are true, and it's not an uncommon pattern in the United States more generally. And this is why I think one of the reasons why it's inaccurate to think of social class just in terms of education. It's the easiest way for pollsters, I think, or perhaps that's one of the reasons. The education gap is nevertheless important, and I think that adds some complexity to realize that the higher educated are for Harris and the higher income are for Trump. They lean that way. And then the last part there where it says among those who rate the U.S. economy, this is a little bit misleading because people rate the economy based on party identity. I won't say you should throw it out altogether. I think the economy is very important, and I'll talk more about that. But in general, we're not sure exactly why. I have my theories, but Republicans, all people have a tendency, both parties have a tendency to rate the economy lower when the other party is in power. It's a Biden administration, so the Republicans will tend to rate the economy lower. That pattern is even stronger among Republicans. In other words, Republicans are even more likely to just, Biden's in power, the economy sucks. That tends to be the pattern considerably more than the Democrats. But nevertheless, we can see here that Trump appeals more to people who rate the economy only fair or poor. A good chunk of that is because are essentially Republicans because they're Republican. Nevertheless, the economy is important, and that pattern is, reflects something that's valuable and that we need to make sense of as well. Now I'm going to switch to another poll. It's a little more recent, but I want you to see that the patterns are different. So this is partly to say polling, you end up with different patterns, and the overall pattern is nearly, quite close. Harris versus Trump just among all Hispanic voters. But the gender gap looks much larger here, right? So it's a huge gender gap. Did that happen within a month? Did that gender gap grow that much? Probably not. It's probably related to differences in the sample that don't reflect the population, and so we don't really know. It's possible the gender gap has grown some. I think it's unlikely it's grown as much. If you were to go back to the previous slide, you can see that there was a relatively minimal gender gap between men and women and voting, among Hispanic voters. And now it's a quite large one where you see the men are almost even between Harris and Trump, whereas the women, there's an over 30 percentage point difference. So that's a problem. Similarly, they've cut age a little differently here, but here we see that it's the older voters who are more supportive of Harris, whereas in the last poll that we were looking at, it's the younger voters. So this could, again, this indicates problems with presidential polling. I haven't gone into this in any kind of depth. Those of you who are interested, I would like to share and would like to learn more about some of the defects and some of the problems of doing accurate polling. I'd like to share some information with you if you were to reach out to me. But here we then also see that the education gap is pretty similar to what we saw before. The chart on the left, I think, shows us a very important pattern. It breaks Latino registered voters down by religion, and it's only showing us the three largest religious affiliations: Protestant, Catholic, and unaffiliated. And it shows there's then it shows us support for either Trump or Harris among those three groups. What stands out the most is the Protestants, many of whom, as I've mentioned, are evangelical. The Protestants, Protestant Latinos are 65% for Trump and 33% for Harris. That's very strong Trump support among the evangelical Protestants, or among the Protestants, many of whom are evangelical is a more accurate way to say that. This is a pattern. It's my understanding this is a pattern that has shifted and moved in this direction of pro-Trump, pro-Republican over the last couple decades. So this would help the influence of the evangelical Protestants, a much larger group than many people realize among Latinos. Their move towards Trump, their support for Trump is an important factor in understanding why Latinos are more associated with Trump now. On the right focuses on, and it asks people, which issues do you consider very important in this election? And then it breaks it down by party. So I want to make sure you're reading this right, and then we'll talk just a little bit about it, and you can look at it yourself as well. Overall, at the far right, looking at all Latino voters, they rate the economy number one, healthcare number two, violent crime number three, tied with gun policy, etc. You can go on down, right? And so you can see that even though Trump is currently trying to make immigration the main issue, his central issue, it's not actually considered very important by as many people as the economy. It's also important and worthwhile to notice the differences between parties in this. It is the case that both Democrats and Republicans rate the economy very important, but Republicans are more likely to do this. This reflects how the Republicans are running on Trump is running on the economy and tagging Harris with the high inflation, something that we're going to look at later. Um, the Democrats, on the other hand, are running more on health care, and the Democratic the Harris supporters rate health care more important. How are they running on that? They're running on it in terms of Trump wants to get rid of Obamacare, and Trump tried to get rid of Obamacare, which has become very popular among the majority of Americans. Trump's also running on crime more and focusing here on violent crime. You can see that the Republican supporters of Trump rate that higher, whereas Harris is running more on gun policy, and you can and consequently that the Harris supporters rate gun policy higher. So this gives you an idea of how Harris supporters and Trump supporters overlap, but also differ in terms of the issues that they think are most important. Now I'm going to turn to three more detailed arguments that look at and try to understand why it is, how it is that so many Latinos are supporting Trump, and how this support for Trump has increased over time. The first one is I'm summarizing it here is how strong are Latinos' sense of shared fate and Latino identities. I'll be unpacking that. The second one is Trump and Republicans' reliance on racial threat and culture wars and how this affects Latinos. And then the third one is how Biden-Harris have been successfully blamed for high inflation and the economic stresses that this causes. And we're going to be saying more about all three of these. So this question of how strong are Latinos' sense of shared fate and Latino identity, to answer this and think about this, I'm to a great extent going to be thinking with Paulo Ramos's study, Defectors, the rise of the Latino far right and what it means for America. You're going to be listening to an interview of her that gives you, I think the interviewer does a good job of drawing out some important insights that she has. And she does a good job of talking about some individual people in ways that are linked to this idea of shared fate and strong ethnic identity. Let's define the terms to make sure that we understand them. They're interrelated and overlapping, but they're also somewhat separate as well. Shared fate is where you see your experiences and opportunities as tied to the fate of others in your groups. It's your perception. You have a sense of shared fate if you feel that your opportunities to, the kinds of things that you've experienced and the kinds of opportunities that you have to achieve your goals are tied to how your group, how in this case, how Latinos are treated in society and viewed in society. So if you have strong shared fate, then you feel, if you're a Latino who has strong shared fate with other Latinos, you think that your experiences and our opportunities are tied to the fate of other Latinos. If you have strong ethnic identity, this is where your ethnic identity is a core part of who you are. You perceive it as a core part. If people ask, who are you? Let me know who you are in some way. Then one of the most important things that will come out is, well, it's an important part of who I am is my Latino culture. So it's the core part or the core meaning of who you are is if that's a strong ethnic identity, it's at the core. The two are related and overlapping. What I mean is that if you have a strong ethnic identity, there's a tendency for you to have a strong shared fate, but there also can be separate, and I'll use myself as an example. I have a strong, it's not an ethnic identity. But it's not a racial identity, but it could be viewed as an ethnic or regional identity. Because from growing up in southeastern Ohio, I have a strong identity as Appalachian, as somebody who grew up in that region of the country that gets labeled Appalachia. And that's I value that culture. I identify with those people. On the other hand, I, to a very large extent, have moved away from that culture. I live in California now, and I don't, and through education, I don't look at it like I have as much of a shared fate. I feel like I have somewhat of my experience affected, as somebody who comes from that area was affected somewhat. But if I was asked a shared fate question, I would be fairly low on that, where if I was asked an identity question, I would be fairly high. I'm just pointing out that there can be variations on that, and I encourage you to think about your own identities, about how the shared fate and the identities can vary or overlap. In general terms, Ramos is raising a variety of things that I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. And so I just want to give you this a little bit of background here. Her view is that racial identity and fitting into the U.S. racial order is quite complex for many Latinos. It's influenced by migration and the traumas of migration for many Latinos, and she believes that the traumas of migration can get past, and the sacrifices that go along with those traumas, they can be passed down across generations. So just because you're second or third generation doesn't mean that you haven't been affected by the traumas of migration, in her viewpoint. Another is kind of sort of two interrelated things are the process of acculturation, of adapting to American culture and language, and also simultaneously integration into the U.S. racial order, which is in her view, a view that I share, strongly structured by a white-black binary. And what she means by that is to be quite simple, and I'd be happy to talk to you more about this, is that our racial order, the status order that is rooted in our history of slavery and Indian removal, is one that is built around a white-black binary where whiteness is equated with being civilized and the preferred race, and blackness is stigmatized. In addition, ours is a society that, although we are a nation of immigrants, we also have waves of high xenophobia. One something that's happening right now, as evidence. Trump is a prime example of that, right? Xenophobia, stereotyping and fear of the outsider, prejudice against the outsider, prejudice against immigrants, right? And so acculturating and integrating into a racial order characterized by a white-black binary and high xenophobia, she says, shapes the racial identity and of many Latinos. In addition, she talks about how the racial and colonial history in people's country of origin also plays a role. And I'm going to touch on this just a little bit, but this is something that could be explored more. One of the things that Ramos references is that many Latino voters also identify as other races. Uh, they, there are Asian Latinos, Asian identifying Latinos, Afro or Black identifying Latinos, Indigenous or Native identifying Latinos, and there's a very large number of Latinos who identify as white. Ramos thinks of that as them referencing their Spanish ancestry. Oftentimes, they will adopt the identity of Hispanic in part to reference that Spanish ancestry, and that she believes that this is them leaning towards whiteness, I guess you could say. More generally, she talks about how that she believes that the multiracialness of many Latinos it creates a condition or goes hand in hand with a condition where many Latinos see themselves as kind of biracial or bicultural and view themselves as kind of moving between categories. This can also reflect the migration experience where you feel rooted in one nationality and whatever it is to be American. And American is, again, equated oftentimes with whiteness. In addition, many come from countries, their families or themselves come from countries where the racial boundaries are not the same as in the United States. There's not, the racial boundaries aren't as strong, they're not as emphasized, they're not officially recognized, and there's not a strong black-white binary. She believes that this contributes to or facilitates a kind of almost color blindness or a tendency for Latinos to lean Hispanic in the white direction. I think that that's an intriguing argument that I need to make sense of more myself, but I just want to put that out there. Thinking in terms of how Latinos are navigating the racial status order in the United States with its hierarchical black-white binary, a couple of things stand out that she really highlights in that interview that you'll listen to. One is that assimilation in getting incorporated into the dominant culture is both equated with moving up and equated with moving in the direction of whiteness. And who represents the dominant culture? It's still whites that represent the dominant culture. This is one place where I would argue with her. I think in states like California, the dominant or the mainstream culture is increasingly more multiracial, and so that's something we could talk about. But nevertheless, she clearly sees this, and I see this argument that assimilation is both moving up in society, which many immigrants hope to do this and work hard to do this and sacrifice to do this, but also assimilating into the dominant white culture as well. She also believes that there are processes in this navigating, in this and being incorporated into the racial status order. There are processes of disidentification, distancing yourself from the xenophobic stereotypes of Latino immigrants, which Trump is amplifying to a great extent now. He's reinforcing those xenophobic stereotypes. They're criminals. They've got bad genes, all kinds of stuff. You're seeing it all. I know you're all paying attention to the election. You're seeing it all. And then also disidentification from blackness. Again, think about the black-white binary. Where do I fit in? Should I distance myself should I identify more with blackness? Should identify more with whiteness is kind of the process that I think that she's discussing or referencing. So, for example, she talks about the Afro-Latino supporters, the people that phenotypically, in terms of how they appear physically, would be in the United States, would be identified as black. I think everybody has probably taken a sociology class where they've talked about the one drop rule and how strong that still is in the way in which Americans look at race, and that's somewhat unique to America, to the United States. But what she kind of highlights is the Afro-Latino supporters of Trump who assert that they are Hispanic and not black. No, I'm not black. Hispanic is my race. That is a kind of distancing self or disidentification from blackness in her perspective. She also talks about the Tejanos who identify as Hispanic and white, and that's again, in her view, this identification focusing one's racial identity in the whiteness direction. And then in a really powerful part of the interview, she talks about and this one I think is super on the mark. The pressure to prove one's sense of belonging as real Americans, as true Americans, which has these associations with whiteness, makes Latinos vulnerable to the pressures of xenophobia. And she, at one point, they're talking about, and they talk about, are Latinos the Irish or Italians of yesterday? And what they're referencing is, and again, I think many of you have already, in a sociology class or a history class, learned this. But if you look at the history of Irish in America, or if you look at the history of Italians in America, when they first arrive in large numbers, they are viewed as a vilified racial minority. They're racialized as, darker and swarthy and uncivilized and wild and things like that. And that as some of them start to move up into the middle classes, those middle class Irish or the middle class Italians, they begin to disidentify with the wild Irish, with the rough Irish, and say, and begin to think of themselves as more as white and less as Irish. And what she's suggesting or raising the possibility is that this same process may be happening with Latinos as well, and that the pressures of xenophobia you know, really heighten that. One of the things that comes to my mind in this context is I go back, and I know many of you have only, you know, heard about this and maybe read about it a little bit. But if you go back and look at 9/11 in 2001, when the 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 United States was attacked by the Islamic terrorists, there, many people who might be in the United States, you could see it in San Francisco and Oakland, where I was around at the time, that many people who could be identified as being Arab or Muslim, even if they weren't Arab or Muslim, they would put out American flags to try to prove that they were, you know, really Americans, you know, were true Americans, and that there was a similar kind of pressure to prove your Americanness. This is you know, this is one of the results, according to her theory, which I think has a lot of power to it, of xenophobia. So in some sense, you could say that Trump's xenophobia, one of the effects of it is to put pressure on people to identify more with the white mainstream, and and as they identify more with the white mainstream, maybe they become Trump supporters, or maybe supporting Trump can be a sign of that. I'm going to present a couple of tables that support Ramos's argument here. This first one looks at Hispanic or Latino identity, how strong that is, right? How strong that ethnic or racial identity is. And then associating that with support for Trump or Harris. And we can see here that among Harris supporters, those that have almost 3 out of 5 have say that being Hispanic or Latino is very or extremely important to how they think about themselves. In other words, 3 out of 5 Harris supporters have a very, you know, very strong Hispanic or Latino identity. Whereas for Trump supporters, it's only 2 out of 5. So there is that pretty solid. It's not super strong. It's a pretty solid association there between supporting Harris and having a strong Hispanic or Latino identity. I hope you see how that connects to her theory. If you don't, then I encourage you to reach out to me and we'll talk about it more. The flip side is very similar. Those that, you know, Harris supporters, it's only 1 out of 5 who say that their Hispanic or Latino identity is not very or not at all important to them, where it's coming up on 2 out of 5 Trump supporters that say that. So overall, you would say that the people with the stronger Hispanic, Latinos with the stronger Hispanic or Latino ethnic racial identity are more likely to go with Harris. And that fits her, you know, that fits her theory. This slide most directly gets at Ramos's idea of shared fate. The idea that we can see here, it's captured in this question here. How much do you think that what happens generally to Hispanic people in this country will affect what happens in your life? So that there's a sense that your fate, in your experience, is tied to your racial or ethnic group. And overall, her thesis is that she wishes Latinos had a stronger sense of shared fate. She thinks that's what would be best for them politically. What we're looking at here is to see does shared fate influence presidential voting? And we can see that I would describe this as a moderately strong relationship. And I want to kind of describe it and then make sure you understand this connection between shared fate among Latinos and presidential vote. So it's broken down into the two different candidates. By the way, this is the 2020 election because I couldn't find a 2024 survey that had a good shared fate item or set of items on it. So at any rate, this is looking at Trump versus Biden in 2020, and it's looking, of course, only at the Latino voters, right? And what we see is that among the Biden voters, 30% of them said that they had a lot of shared fate. That they rate, they answered this question there a lot. That they connected the what happens to them to what happens generally to Hispanic people. Whereas among Trump voters, it was only 7%. And then on the flip side, if we look at those that said not at all or not very much, they're basically saying, no, that's not really how I look at things. We see that over half of Trump voters said that they had what she would label low shared fate, whereas around a quarter, a little over a quarter of the voters of Biden's voters said that they had low shared fate. So again, it's not a perfect relationship, but there's a moderately strong relationship here with this idea that shared fate uh, contributes to or is influential on your voting patterns. And that in fact, especially those who have high levels of shared fate, were very likely to vote for Biden. If this isn't clear to you, I really hope that you'll ask questions, and I'd be happy to talk to you about it more. Finally, Ramos talks about how the xenophobic pressures can lead Latinos to strive to assimilate and to look down on those who are not assimilated so that they too can form these strong boundaries between the true American and the outsider, the immigrant who's an outsider, the other. And that process, in her view, that process of adopting that kind of attitude is associated with voting for Trump because he's drawing those strong boundaries as well. And what we see here is a pattern that very much fits that theory, where we see notice that the question is how important is being able to speak English for being truly American, and then it's broken down by voting for Trump. Those that say it's very important, 35% voted for Trump. Those that said it's not very important, just 11% voted for Trump. And those who said it's not important at all, 4% voted for Trump. So this very much fits Ramos's theory as well. A second important explanation for how Latinos are moving towards Trump or why they are supporting Trump is that Latinos are definitely, some Latinos are definitely influenced by Trump's and Republicans' reliance on racial threat and culture wars discourse. We can see this now we've already talked about how heavily Trump is focusing on immigrant threat, which is a form of racial threat. But also you can see him, very frequently now narrow casting racial threat to Latinos and blacks, essentially saying that immigrants are taking Hispanic jobs and black jobs. So, specifically focusing the threat on Latinos and African Americans. In addition, the Trump campaign is widely broadcasting and seems to be amplifying at this time anti-trans ads that portray Harris's support for transgender rights as evidence of her extremism. And so if you're not seeing those ads, let's make sure that you check those out, and maybe I'll link one of those as well so you can see what I'm talking about if you haven't already. I should say just a little bit about culture wars. The culture wars is a long-time strategy of the Republican Party. It's definitely a very concerted strategy where they have sought to draw moral boundaries or to highlight moral boundaries that stigmatize people who deviate from the traditional heterosexual family, and present the Republican Party of holding together traditional family values, and then by extension associating Democrats with immorality. The focus of culture wars has shifted somewhat. The one thing that I think has been fairly consistent across time is abortion, but abortion is, as you know, is actually something that Trump is running away from this term because it's such a winner for the Democrats, because there's so much opposition to the Dobbs decision and the effects that's having on people. But the culture wars, the focus of the culture wars has shifted over time, and I won't go into detail about it, but you can see an example, a clear example is how the Republicans over the last decade or two have moved away from anti-gay marriage stuff. Not completely. It all depends on how things get framed, but they've certainly moved away from anti-gay marriage much more towards anti-trans and anti-transgender type focus in their culture wars. At any rate, I'm going to just show fairly straightforward evidence that shows that high immigrant threat, this is among Latinos, is strongly associated with support for Trump, and that anti-LGBT attitudes, anti-LGBT rights, opposition to LGBT rights is strongly associated with support for Trump among Latinos, and that also the conservative racial ideology that we talked about in a previous lecture that I went over in some detail in a previous lecture is also strongly associated with support for Trump. So I'm about to show you some survey findings on immigrant threat, and I want to explain the immigrant threat scale that is in the next chart. Immigrant threat, which I always put in parentheses Latino, or not always, but frequently, I want to remind you that when people talk about immigrants, they're thinking about Latino immigrants very, very often, and there's quite a bit of social science evidence that supports that. The scale that you're going to see are people who score high on the following things: that they believe that immigration takes away jobs from people that are already here, that they disagree with that immigrants are generally good for Americans' economy, that they agree that America's culture is generally harmed by immigrants, not just the economy's harmed, but the culture is, and they believe there's two items on immigrants increase crime rates in the United States, and illegal immigration increases crime. All of these taken together, if you combine them equally in all of them, it gives you an overall scale of how much people feel threatened by immigrants. And then I take the top roughly 1/3 of that scale, those scoring in the top 1/3, to be people that I define as high on immigrant threat. Let's take a look at that table now. Now this has a lot to it, and there's several things I want to unpack. But let's focus first on the Hispanics or Latinos. And everybody, all the racial groups are broken into high immigrant threat and low immigrant threat. And the percentages there are people who voted for Trump in 2020 by their level, by their race, it's broken down by race, and their level of immigrant threat. So for I'm going to focus on the Hispanics here first. We see that 14% of those with lower immigrant threat voted for Trump, whereas 61% who scored high on immigrant threat voted for Trump. So this shows that Latinos in 2020, this is a 2020 study, this is a survey where I could get this rich immigrant threat measure. Latinos who perceive high immigrant threat were very much support, much more likely to support Trump. Notice that that's also the case for whites, Asian Americans to a little bit less of extent, but still a substantial extent. Asian Americans, another group who are sometimes portrayed as perpetual outsiders, no matter how long they're here. Native Americans and people who are multiracial, right? And so the one group that stands out as quite different is African Americans. And I want to bring back in the idea, in addition to highlighting that Latinos, and we could look at the other groups too, but I want to highlight that Latinos are influenced by immigrant threat to a substantial extent. And that's affecting their politics. They're voting for Trump more. Notice that there are also high African Americans that are high on immigrant threat, but they're not that much more likely to vote for Trump. It's only 16%. You could say, well, that's still a pretty big jump, but overall, in terms of magnitude, it's only 1 out of 6 who experience high immigrant threat. So African Americans are affected by immigrant threat too, and perceive immigrant threat. And some people would argue that they justifiably perceive immigrant threat more than other racial groups. But nevertheless, it doesn't affect their voting. And this, I think, goes back to that idea and is a good illustration of shared or linked fate, that African Americans feel both a stronger sense of shared and linked fate, and that shared or linked fate affects their politics or their political behavior more on average. I want to avoid overstating what I just said in terms of the influence of immigrant threat. And what this chart shows is it looks at percentage scoring high on immigrant threat by race. And what we see right away is that both Latinos and Asian Americans, the two groups most associated with immigration, score the lowest, are the ones that are least likely to score high on immigrant threat. So while the Latinos that score high on immigrant threat were quite affected and influenced to move towards Trump, it is also true that they score considerably lower on immigrant threat than whites, African Americans, Native Americans, and mixed race people, and the same as Asian Americans. Before moving to anti-LGBT, I want to remind us or revisit the tension, this time focusing on Latinos, or the conflicts that people have, contradictions even that people have in their views on immigration policy. This is a statement that doesn't name Trump, but it reflects Trump's call to deport all undocumented immigrants. And what this shows is that among Latinos, 44%, over 2 out of 5, support mass deportation. Maybe if they used the language of mass deportation with detention centers and et cetera, that number would go down. But if you just name it as deporting immigrants living in the United States illegally, 44% of Latinos support that, which is almost as much as the 48% that oppose it. And then you can see that the Trump supporters, of course, are much more in support of that, and the Harris supporters are much more in opposition. On the other hand, in the same survey, and in fact, I think the questions were asked almost one after the other. Do you support providing a pathway to citizenship for all undocumented immigrants currently living in the United States? With no other conditions set on that, 7 out of 8 Harris supporters do, and even 2 out of 5. This is all, again, they're all Latinos. 2 out of 5 Trump supporters do, and overall, 2 out of 3 Latinos in this survey supported a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. So this again shows that Latinos are feeling the same tension. They want a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, but they also want to throw a large number undocumented immigrants out. Clearly, some of them, the survey that, I wasn't able to get the raw data, so I can't show you how many, but some of them are believing both. Some of them support what are clearly contradictory policies. Okay, now let's move to the anti-LGBT rights and the attitude scale. And this one is, again, it's from the 2020 election. The same patterns are happening now with a greater emphasis on transgender. But you can see here, I'm not going to go through each one, but you can see all the different items. There's a total of 7 that went into making this scale, including that the supporting the idea that transgender people should have to use bathrooms of the gender they were assigned at birth. So, essentially disrespecting, making it illegal for transgender people to perform as their existing gender identity. And also, with regard to the same-sex couples, you can see how Republicans have this reflects how Republicans have taken the culture wars with regard to gay and lesbian. Business owners should be allowed to refuse services to same-sex couples if gay marriage goes against their religious beliefs. So saying that this is not discriminating, what it's doing is it's allowing, we should be allowed to discriminate if that's what our if that reflects our religious morals. Opposing gays and lesbians being able to adopt, but even included in the scale is opposition to legal recognition of gay marriage. Let's see what the results are. So this chart, what it does is it takes that scale of LGBT rights, opposition, I want to make it clear. People that have high opposition to LGBT rights and people who have low opposition. I'm putting the more conservative view as higher on the scale, right? And then it breaks it down by race, just like we did with immigrant threat. And then it's reporting the percentage of who voted for Trump by the different levels of opposition to LGBT rights. So for Latinos, we see that of those that had high opposition to LGBT rights, 47% voted for Trump, whereas those that had low opposition, it was only 16%. That's a 31 percentage point gap. That's a pretty big gap. When we compare it to African Americans, the African American gap is much less. It's 13 percentage points. And so what we might conclude from this, or at least hypothesize, is that the African Americans, because they have a greater sense of shared fate or linked fate, they are they're even those that are more conservative on LGBT rights are not as particularly inclined to vote for Trump, which he represents the party of that opposes LGBT rights and has a history of opposing it. So if you look at the Latinos compared to the African Americans, this again looks like Latinos have weaker shared fate, and so as a result, they're more influenced by their opposition to LGBT. That influences their voting more, their opposition to LGBT rights. I hope you understand that argument and you'll ask questions if you're not clear about that. Now, if we compare the Latinos to all the other groups, the whites, the Asian American, the Native American, the Asian American, of course, include Pacific Islanders too. I didn't have space to include that there, but they're part of that, considered part of that group. The Native Americans and also mixed race people. That what we see is that Latinos, their gap is actually less than all those other groups. So it's possible that this is evidence of how Latinos' shared fate or linked fate, at least on this issue, may be a little stronger. There could be other explanations as well, but it does stand out as both. How I would summarize it is that opposition to LGBT rights influences Latinos vote for Trump, or did in 2020 quite a bit, but not as much as it did for whites, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and mixed race people. However, considerably more than it did for African Americans. Now I'm going to take, this is 2024, a more recent one, and look at what the two statements are here. The obstacles that once made it harder for black people to get ahead are now largely gone. What does that reflect? That reflects that conservative racial ideology that I talked about previously. And then the other option is there are still significant obstacles that make it harder for black people to get ahead. And here we see quite sharp, not what I would call extremely strong, but strong differences in terms of linking these beliefs to the different candidates. So 55% of the Trump supporters but chose the conservative racial ideology, that the obstacles that made it harder for black people to get ahead are now largely gone. They're not saying that discrimination's gone all the way, but that's not the main obstacle now. 55% of Trump supporters believe that, whereas only 19% of Harris supporters did. So what this indicates is that Latinos are also, the same way that we saw all Americans were, which were, as we know, predominantly white, that Latinos are very much influenced by that conservative racial ideology, moving them in the direction of supporting Trump. The third explanation for why Latinos are turning to Trump, especially in the 2024 election, is an economic explanation. The Biden-Harris administration are held accountable for the high inflation that we had in 21 and 2021, beginning going up in 2021, peaking in 22, and coming down over the last couple years. Um, it makes sense that this is an issue that would be really important to Latinos. And we saw that Latinos care most about the economy in terms of the issues earlier. And then when you, in other surveys, in another survey I'm going to show you in a little bit, where you're not just saying which issues are very important, but you say which is the most important. The economy is the most important one for Latinos. They care most about the economy, and many have been stressed by inflation, and that inflation comes on the heels of a lot of COVID dislocation. Many Latinos lost jobs. They were among the largest group of essential workers. So they were exposed to a lot of risks. I think that COVID and the economy after COVID has been very tough and traumatic for many Latinos, and that this helps explain why there's such a focus on the economy. The COVID led to the highest inflation since 1979, and we're going to look at that in a little more detail. The COVID inflation was a global phenomenon. It wasn't just something that happened in the United States. The Federal Reserve, I think it's fair to say, as a summary statement, that the Federal Reserve, the Trump and the Biden administration successfully navigated the COVID economic crisis with a soft landing, meaning that they were able to control inflation, bring it under control, that inflation was happening in many countries globally. They were able to unlike a number of wealthy countries, they were able to bring that inflation under control without triggering a recession, without triggering a spike in unemployment. Overall, it's fair to say that the U.S. economy has fared much better than the economies of most countries through the COVID crisis. However, most people don't care about what causes the inflation. Biden was in charge, and so Biden is viewed as responsible. This is kind of how the presidency and the economy works. Economically distressed Latinos, like many other Americans, feel that they did better under Trump than under Biden. Let me show you from this New York Times survey evidence of this. So this is essentially asking the question, how did Biden's and Trump's policies affect you? Doesn't directly name the economy, but I think that this is reflecting the feelings about the economy. And you can see that Trump people, 35% felt that Trump's policies helped them, and only 22% of Latinos felt that Biden's policies helped them. In terms of being hurt, 34% felt that Biden's policies hurt them. I think that's, again, largely reflecting the economy. And that 30% felt that Trump's policies hurt them, and that probably reflected more his immigration policies. So Trump, the feeling that Trump helped you out more is, significantly higher among Latinos. Trump helped them out more than Biden did. I want to step back, though, and talk about the COVID shocks to the economy, because one of the themes in this class is that politics, and especially campaign politics, there's kind of a disconnect between reality and campaigning that we've talked about and I've pointed out numerous times, and I'm going to do that again here. Um, COVID, I'm going to take us back to spring 2020. COVID led to shutdowns all over the world in spring 2020. This was many, many places. And the shutdowns happened then, and then with other surges, there were, additional shutdowns that happened sometimes for long, like in China, for long periods of time. The shutdowns led to a deep but short recession. So there was steep unemployment. A lot of people lost their work. A lot of companies got forgivable loans from the government to try and keep people employed, but that only lasted for a little while, and like I said, a lot of people lost work. Nevertheless, the economy started growing back. By the end of summer, it was beginning to grow back, and this was, things were opening up. The government stimulus in 2020, which was during the Trump administration bipartisan bill, the CARES Act, and the 2021 American Rescue Plan, a follow-up, I think $1.9 trillion stimulus kept people and the economy going. So both the Trump and the Biden administrations Biden had more trouble getting bipartisan support, but they got enough support to get the American Rescue Plan through. Uh, a lot of people, as I said, lost jobs, 8 million. And however, what many people at the time or shortly thereafter called the Great Resignation turned out to be more of a great reshuffling, where people moved to other kinds of jobs. When they went back to work, when they lost their job, when they went back to work, they oftentimes found employers that were prepared to pay them more, because didn't come. You may recall, people didn't come back to work right away. They had the checks coming in, and so they were able to sort of figure out where they wanted to go. And so employers, which were, building back up, oftentimes had to offer higher pay, and that helped increase the pay, especially of low-end, lower wage workers. Because of COVID consumer spending, in addition, COVID consumer spending shifted from in-person services to goods. So there's less of a demand for, at this point in time, travel, restaurants, hotels, massages and stuff like that, and more for goods. People stopped going to health clubs for a while, and they bought a spin bike, or they bought running shoes, or something like that. Supply chains for goods, because everybody's shifting they've got money, they're shifting to buying goods. Supply chains for goods got overloaded because of the increased demand, but also because of the disruptions, that they had lost workers because of the shutdowns, and they had, and as I said, there was this great reshuffling going on, and this was happening globally. This led to shortages and sharp price increases, initially in particular goods. I remember how my son was looking to buy a car at the time, and he just decided not to. He decided he would wait and figure that out another time, because the price of cars, just shot up like crazy. I also remember getting I had we have a 2015 car, and we started getting phone calls from a dealer saying, that they would give us more or less what we paid for it if we would sell it back to them then. So car prices shot up, some other things shot up, but by the end of 21, this was in early 21, and by the end of 21, inflation was broadening. It had kind of spread throughout the economy. It was no longer just the particular shortages. It was becoming more general. And as I said earlier, inflation was global. You can click on that link there, and you can see that what was happening in the United States was happening all over the place. Um, There were then, on top of that, I believe that I would locate this in roughly early 2022, new supply shocks from the war in Ukraine, especially around energy and wheat, and keeping in mind Russia's a major supplier of gasoline and natural gas, oil and natural gas products. Ukraine's a major supplier of wheat globally. And there was also slowdowns in production because of waves of COVID lockdowns, including in China, which had, as I mentioned, had long time lockdowns. And these additional shocks added to inflation and broadened inflation. So the inflation rose sharply in 2021 and the first half of 2022, peaking at 9% in mid 2022. The Federal Reserve responded to the increased inflation, to the alarmingly high inflation, by raising the federal funds interest rates from 0.25%, that's a quarter of a percentage point, up to 5.5% between early 2022 and mid 2023. Their goal was to cool the economy and tame inflation by lowering demand. The basic logic is that if you make money more expensive, it costs more money to borrow money, then that's going to stop businesses from growing as much, and it's going to stop individuals from buying as much. This also, however, had the effect of raising the effective cost of big items like homes and cars. And so some people are reacting not just to the inflation, but to the highest interest rates in terms of their perception of how the economy is doing. This worked. The Federal Reserve plan, the combined plan of stimulus from the Trump and the Biden administrations and the Federal Reserve's raising the interest rates apparently worked. The supply chains everything gets opened up over time. China comes out of its lockdown. People stop focusing on COVID and things become more and more normalized. Service economy is recovering, etc. And inflation, it also worked in the sense that they successfully have brought inflation down to, most recently I saw 2.2%. Their target is 2%. That's awfully close to that, right? And further, this was achieved without a recession. People talk about this as a soft landing, and this was no small feat, because unemployment, by a soft landing, you mean that there was never a spike in unemployment, and economic growth continued at the same time. So you're cooling the economy with not cooling it too much that you get a decline in economic growth and a spike in unemployment. That's what they mean by a soft landing. Unemployment never got above 4.3%, and I think that was just for a month or two. It was for a lot of the time, it was below 4%, and it's hovering right around 4% now. Several wealthy countries, I can't name all of them, I'm familiar with Japan and Germany, have gone through recessions dealing with these same COVID shocks. So globally, uh, global observers look at it and say in the U.S., the pandemic economy and their response to it has been outstanding. The U.S. pandemic economy grew much more than economies, pandemic economies of other wealthy countries. And furthermore, the real buying power, the wage increases adjusted for inflation, including this high inflation, grew during the pandemic, unlike most other wealthy countries. And not only that, but the wages of low wage workers, uh, a number of them were essential workers, grew the most, grew 13.2% during the pandemic. So it would not be, if you're looking at this from a kind of macroeconomic perspective, it might be fair to conclude that the managers of the U.S. economy did a really good job of taking us through a severe shock to the economy, taming inflation with a soft landing, and growing the real purchasing power of especially low-wage workers. This is an argument that it's not hard to find people making. So if the picture is that in terms of, and you're looking at it in a macro political economic sense, how did the Biden administration building on the stimulus during the Trump administration and the Federal Reserve, how did they handle the economic crisis, the COVID economic crisis? Then you could say that they deserve an A or an A plus. But this isn't how people perceive, I think you already know this, that this isn't how people perceive the economy. And here's how I want to sort of shift the frame on this. We in the United States have been undergoing an affordability crisis for a long time. It's not a new thing. You can't blame it on Biden. You can't blame it on Trump. It's been going on for quite a while. We might consider that exacerbated by COVID inflation, that it's kind of coming to a head now. And there may even be something like a consensus that we need to redo the economy and the politics, and that I believe that people across political parties actually agree with this idea now. But anyhow, when I say there's an affordability crisis, what I mean is that at the major costs of housing, whether you're talking about renting or buying, childcare, health care, if you have to buy it yourself, or if you're looking at expenses that aren't covered by your insurance, your work insurance, uh, uh, and college educations have all risen faster than the overall rate of inflation and the overall rate of wage increases for many years. In other words, their inflation is outstripping people's wages and wage increases. And this has made it so, even though it doesn't show up on the consumer price index, which gets indexed a certain way, that these things, these big major costs have become almost out of reach for more and more people. And then when you add on top of that the COVID inflation, and here I'm going to focus especially on food because that's what people see, it adds a sense of desperation, of almost economic desperation. I may be exaggerating this a little bit, but I think the part when Trump talks about how the America's it's going everything's going to hell, even though I think he's personally I think he's quite misguided on that. I think he's tapped into the economic distress that many people are feeling. So you've got the long-term affordability crisis, and then you have the COVID inflation. And here it's important to realize that people notice food and gas inflation more than they do other kind. Generally, they notice those more than they do other kinds of inflation. And food inflation increased more and it came down more slowly than the consumer price index. Of course, food's part of the consumer price index, but if you just single it out, the part of inflation that people see the most, they see their loaf of bread going from, a couple dollars to $3 over a short period of time. That kind of thing. That that sort of inflation is something that people see and they feel more. And that, it is the case that food increased at a higher rate and it came down more slowly than than the overall CPI or other similar, whatever the inflation indexes that the Federal Reserve and the macro economists rely on. Overall, during the pandemic, between 2019 and 2023, there was a 25% increase in food prices. That's just taking a general food basket, and that's a 25% increase. If you put it on top of that affordability crisis, and then when you look at how many Americans are living on the edge economically, then I think you have a good sense. If you haven't experienced this yourself, then I think that this will give you a good sense of why so many people are blaming Biden administration, by extension Harris, and trust Trump more around the economy. In 2023, to give you a couple of examples here, 1/6 of Americans have bills that they can't pay. They're at the end of the month, they don't have enough money to pay all their bills. That's 1 out of 6. In 2023, 63% said that they could pay an emergency $400 expense if they had to go to an ER or whatever. It's like you're asked to imagine if all of a sudden you had to pay $400 for something that you hadn't planned for, would you be able to? 63% said they could. That means that, I interpret that 37% said that they couldn't, and that 63% was down from 68% in 2021. Keep in mind, 2021, more people were getting those stimulus checks as well, right? So there's a decline a flip side of that is that there's an increase in people who are living on the edge economically. And similarly, in 2023, 72% reported being comfortable financially, and this was down from 78% in 2021. So this is, again, what I would say is that there's a brew of an affordability, a long-standing affordability crisis. The large number of people who are living on the edge economically, and the inflation, especially in the area of food, that increased 25% in a 4-year period. So how does all this translate into campaign politics? Let's go back to campaign politics now. Let's say that the situation is that the stress over COVID inflation has been combined with the longer term strains of the affordability crisis, the college debt that people have, that's excessive, and the unaffordability of housing, that you have to move further and further away from where you work just to be able to afford a place to live, this kind of thing. And that this has made it so that the economic conditions have become dire for a larger number of people, that the COVID inflation on top of this has made it really tough for a lot of people. And that the COVID inflation happened on Biden's watch. And so I think that what has happened, and I think this isn't rocket science, Trump has relatively easily successfully framed COVID inflation as caused by Biden and Harris, and then by extension, saying that Harris is at the cause of, it's the Harris administration that has caused the suffering that you're experiencing. And I think that they have, Vance especially, has an effective line by saying, why didn't Harris fix things when she was in power? She had, if she has all these ideas, why didn't she, for helping people out, why didn't she do that? She's been in power for almost 4 years now. I think that's been effective. And the polls, I think you probably know this already, but the polls bring this out. And I want to emphasize, that this is maybe especially the case for Latinos. And I think that this is a major reason, because Latino Americans, a great number of them are working class people who have struggled a lot because of the COVID inflation. And so in that New York Times Siena poll that I've referred to, 27% of Latinos said that the economy was the most important issue to them. They didn't just say it's a very important issue, but when they asked them which is the issue that's most important to them, over 1 out of 4 said that the economy, that was their top issue. And of those, 62% planned to vote for Trump and 34% for Harris. Almost twice as many planned to vote for Trump that saw the economy as the most important issue. So what this does for me is it raises a question that I would like to ask you. If you're inclined to answer it, I'd really like to know what you think. Would it be wise for Harris to talk up how well the macroeconomy is doing and then tie this to her economic platform, that opportunity economy platform? Would that be a good thing to do? Because it seems like that might, would that have any chance of changing the frame over the economy, or does she just need to accept that she's going to be held responsible for the COVID inflation and whatever tipping point that created in people's lives? This is kind of what I have in mind, and I'd be interested to know what your reaction is, where she could say something along the lines of, look, COVID caused a lot of inflation all over the world. It caused, a lot of people lost jobs. We had a lot of inflation, but we've worked hard to and we've made our way back to a strong economy, and we've done this better than any other country in the world. And where the situation is that now inflation's under control, it's back down, and not only that, but real purchasing power is growing, especially for the people who suffered the most from COVID inflation. And then she could talk about and show that how that she understands how difficult and how challenging that's been. And then turn to, we're going to keep building on this through our opportunity economy. Now, I think that she has said a version of that, but I don't think that I think that she has focused more on, looking ahead to her opportunity economy. And I just wonder if she would like to more directly address the way that she is being held accountable for the COVID inflation. The final thing that I want to add is to just mention, because we previously have looked at Trump's tariffs, which is apparently the center of his economic policy. It's a little hard to pin him down, but that seems to be the main thing. That, along with renewing the tax cuts, which, as we've looked at before, help people in different economic situations, but especially help that the lion's share of that money goes to the upper middle classes and the upper classes. Harris's Opportunity Economy platform, I want to circle back and talk about the affordability crisis. Harris's Opportunity Economy platform, it focuses on strengthening unions. That's kind of a centerpiece. But it also focuses on some big parts of that affordability crisis. Housing, childcare, and healthcare are really central to it. And so in that sense, her economic policy is addressing that affordability crisis, and that can be the basis for strengthening her the appeal of her economic platform. It also focuses on growing small businesses, which is something that a lot of Latinos and African Americans are interested in. So that could also be another strength of the opportunity economy. Final point is that these things all sound good. In terms, when I hear the opportunity economy, I do see that addressing the affordability crisis and perhaps turning around that long-term neglect of working class interests. But I think any good economist would say that, and political economists especially, because that brings politics into it too, that in order for the kinds of things she's talking about to work, they need to be longer term commitments. I don't see any quick fixes to the affordability crisis that we have built up for ourselves over a long period of time. So thank you for your interest, and have a really good week, and I look forward to your reactions to the lecture this week.